Well, good evening, everyone. It is 6 o'clock. I'm gonna get us started, though we still have folks joining us. Hopefully, um, folks will keep joining while I talk. Here is my little intro. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I am Ariel Cates. I'm the Director of Programming at Village Preservation. So glad that you all are here with us this evening. A quick bit about village preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, all of which are now virtual, and most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history, and depth, and the value of preservation in our communities. We are a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. Learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. Well, we call our home the village, but it is also unceded traditional land of the Lenape and Munsee peoples. I want to acknowledge in this archival recording the Lenape and Munsee communities, and especially their elders, past and present, and express gratitude for their stewardship of this land, for contributing to its geography, and for the use of their language as place names. If you'd like to find out more about this, please reach out. I'm glad to offer resources. So just a little bit of Zoom protocol before we get started. Please feel free to use the chat and say hi, tell us where you're joining from, or to raise any issues or thoughts. I won't be on camera, but I will be here in the chat for you. But if you have questions specifically for our speakers, please do use the Q&A function. It just helps me to keep track of your questions a little bit better. You can submit those at any point during the talk, and we'll get to as many as we can. So I am very pleased to introduce our speakers for this evening. Derek Edwards is a tour guide and facilitator of enjoyment. He guides tours throughout greater New York City and is a stand-up comedy performer and entertainer, bringing people together with empathy, knowledge, and a love of the arts. Eric Chase is a tour guide, reading and research enthusiast, and founder of New York's literary pub crawl, Touring Greenwich Village and Beyond since 1998. And I've got links for both of them that I'm gonna put in the chat. And Eric and Derek, it always gives me a great pleasure to say your names one after the other. Thank you so much, and take us away.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Ariel. We're really excited to be here. So just a little bit of background for everyone. So Derek and I first met when we did a tour for Ariel for a theater tour last year.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of met briefly at the beginning. We both led two groups where we took folks from different theaters around the village, and then everyone would get a chance to go inside, see like a 2-minute, 3-minute scene from the theater, and talk to some of the people who run it. And then we'd point out a few spaces in between. It was a bit of hustle, as I recall. We had not enough time to walk and talk between the theaters as we went. And when Ariel, I do other tours through with Ariel, and we were looking at doing something in February, and she was looking for some thoughts, and she suggested that maybe Derek and I do another partnership, which I was obviously jumped all over. I was excited to do it based on our conversation we'd had at the end of that previous tour. So we came up with the idea for this. We've been meeting pretty much. We had a few email conversations near the end of last year. But we met with Ariel, I think on January 4th, and then Derek and I had our first rehearsal/meeting on January 7th, the day that the world settled and became the common, wonderful, joyous place that we are in now. That was a really an interesting day to start our first tour, focusing really kind of heavily on what we're sort of referring to as the Black Bohemians. And it's been kind of fun from there. Yeah, Derek?
Yeah, it has. On January 7th, like you said, we were like, well, how do we top that performance? So we, it has been a very fun search. I've learned a lot working with Eric certainly from the literary side, and just all these stories. And you're going to hear that as we go through all these interconnected, these Venn diagrams of life, if you would, of so many people and places and things just reoccurring. We've definitely put a lot of time in research, found some, we think, some very interesting stories.
Yeah, and we're excited to start through. I'm going to share our presentation here. See if I can make sure that I've got the right dynamic here. As I adjust to the technology of Zoom again. But we wanted to start out, so we figured we'd focus on the Black Bohemians is the name of the tour. And Derek hasn't seen this lovely font title, nor has he seen these two pictures that I just pulled off the website. This was from the tour where he and I met, guiding through. This is actually pulled from the video that we could find online. And as you can see,
Oh no.
Ariel, yes. You made it in there, but we're going to start our tour sort of as a sort of a pub crawl of sort of central locations that were really preeminent for the Black artists, writers, thinkers, poets, singers, and really who shaped so much of the culture. But I thought that it would be very fitting to begin at No Pub, because when we talk about the village, certainly as it became settled from the West, and people talk about the exciting things that happened in the village, and there's so much that happened. They talk about Edgar Allan Poe and those early years with himself and Hemingway, not Hemingway, Herman Melville, and their friendship with Everett Augustus Dykink, which is an 1800s name if you ever heard one. And from there, people like to talk about FAFSAR, Walt Whitman, Ada Clare, Mark Twain, that whole side and sort of the debauchery that was happening there was really kicking off the Bohemian movement. I think many people really sort of romanticize the next wave, where really the village became what it is today through Henrietta Rodman, Emma Goldman, Edna Millay, Max Eastman, Floyd Dell, Jack Reed, the Provincetown Players, Eugene O'Neill. You had Willa Cather, Edith Wharton, Louisa May Alcott, James Fenimore Cooper. I mean, the list really kind of goes on and on. Don Powell, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, of just like massive literary and cultural icons in the village. But if you're thinking it through, they're all white. And I won't get into all of the reasons why that is, other than obviously sort of a focus on where much of our education and research went. But just because, and because of that, there wasn't necessarily a lot of places at that time, late 1800s, early 1900s, that were welcoming Black people in bars. You might find a couple here and there, but it wasn't really till the 30s that we began to see sort of an integration of folks both behind the footlights and in front of the footlights. But there was a lot going on, and it's stuff that I didn't know about in my early years as a tour guide. This tour has really helped me research some more and find some new icons there. But we did want to talk about much that was happening, because despite the plethora of literary, artistic clubs, back alley dives, underground gay bars, there weren't a lot of bars for African Americans until the 1930s. But there was a lot of culture, there was a lot of rebellion, a lot of passion, and a lot of history. And I'll let Derek kick us off with that.
And so where we really first start, what a lot of the events and the passion and the culture, when you're talking Greenwich Village, if we're starting in the late 1850s and 1860s, one of the places will come up more than one time is the Cooper Union, the very famed school. And we actually talk about this man right here. You got the young Frederick Douglass there on your left, and you got extra salt. I don't even know if there's pepper in there. That's just extra salt. Frederick Douglass there on the right. But Frederick Douglass comes as a self-taught man who escaped slavery and taught himself how to read, which still is fascinating and beyond description to me. But he comes to the Cooper Union. Now, the Cooper Union, in a lot of ways, is the embodiment of great ideals. For 150 years, it has been a free school. That's been a very hard transition when it switched in the 2010s, just recently. But what ends up happening is they have lots of people go there as great speakers. If you're good enough to get accepted, it's free. So it's really the highest ideas of our society. Hey, if you really are good enough to be here, we're going to make it our best to get here. Well, Frederick Douglass comes, and when he comes, it is actually during the Civil War. But before we even get there, there's another man that comes in 1860, in February, actually this month of 1860, and he's a lanky gentleman from Springfield, Illinois, by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln gives his very famous Cooper Union speech. Some people call it the Might is Right speech. And to summarize it very quickly, he basically said, not allowing slavery to expand to the westward, now the new territories in our West, a majority of our founding fathers actually did believe in that. And he went through different documents and things where they talked where they weren't believing that. So he was taking his anti-slavery stances and saying, this isn't some new thing. This is actually what the Republic, they thought even going forward it would be about. And he spoke so eloquently and so well that that is how he got the Republican nomination for president. He didn't win that day, but a lot of people said, this is the guy we can get behind. Fast forward 3 years later, we are now in the Civil War, and the great orator Douglass comes to speak, but he isn't doing a victory lap because of the Emancipation Proclamation. He's actually pretty doggone annoyed that it's taken this much. And this is his direct quote. Much as I value the present apparent hostility to slavery at the North, I plainly see that it is less the outgrowth of high and intelligent moral conviction against slavery as such than because of the trouble its friends have brought upon the country. I would have slavery hated for that and more. And as you see there with the speech in Rochester, New York, the 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, but I must mourn, saying we haven't quite lived up to that thing. Now he speaks another 4 times here, and the Cooper Union, even there, again, is propelled Lincoln to being a president. So its precedence has always been set. He speaks at his eulogy at the Cooper Union, and he says, Lincoln was snatched away from his work without warning, killed, murdered, assassinated, not because of personal hate, for no man who knew Abraham Lincoln could hate him, but solely because he was the president, the faithful, loyal president of the United States, true to his country and true to the cause of human freedom, taking care that the Constitution and laws were obeyed. For this reason, he was slain. And what this does is set up a background. We could see where Douglass wants to get everybody to just, okay, that's great. Slavery's causing a problem, but can we get to truly living out the ideas that's written in our Declaration of Independence? And so what comes another 40 years later, right after Lincoln's birthday in 1909, after a major race riot, really a suppression in which a young Black man that was kind of an illiterate farmhand is accused of rape of a white woman and lynched in Springfield, Illinois, that the NAACP, as you kind of see, there is formed. And the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, ooh, that's always a lot to say. Mr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who we see right there in front of us, will be the only Black man on the executive council. But interesting enough, a lot of people later on would be grandchildren of abolitionists. One was the Garrison Villiard, who was William Lloyd Garrison's grandson. And he also ran the New York Evening Post as a press. And so the Crisis magazine, and there's Du Bois again, the Crisis magazine will be published there in Lower Manhattan at 20 Vesey Street. That building is still actually in existence if you go there to this day. And so the Crisis comes about, and the Nation is also published there. Even though it originally starts, the NAACP, at the Cooper Union, it moves over to 75th Avenue, and that will become their headquarters. And while it's there, Du Bois will still be the editor, but another person, Jesse Roman Fawcett, was the literary editor, and now you're going to start getting a great amount of thought coming there. You're going to see the published works of Arnett Bontemps, Langston Hughes, County Cullen, and Jean Toomer. So we're now starting to see this whole thing of Black thought in the village there, because now we have the NAACP. They have the flag raised. Somebody was lynched today. And matter of fact, they had to stop raising it after so many years, because when they want to renew their lease, it was basically insinuated, you keep raising that flag and you're gonna have to raise yourself on out of here. So they had to rethink about possibly doing the flag, but there it is. A man was lynched yesterday, right off the Fifth Avenue offices. So they would put that flag up. So we do see that this was thought Where else happens in Greenwich Village with this great thought? Another 30, 40 years later, W.E.B. Du Bois will end up going and start chairing the first African American history course at a non-historically Black college and university, um, other colleges. So at the New School, which is literally right around the corner from 75th Avenue. So we already see there's a lot of thought emanating now, coming out of Greenwich Village all the way back to the 1860s and then moving forward to the NAACP. And from here, speaking of authors, because we already talked about a few, we're going to go to one of the really interesting authors who had a lot to do with some of the people we already know about in Greenwich Village. Eric, take it away.
Well, this would be Claude McKay, whose full name was Festus Claudius McKay. And I just want to repeat that name because it's awesome. Festus Claudius McKay. I mean, that is a classic name. We don't have enough Festuses in the world. And I would encourage you who are thinking about having children to consider the name Festus as one of your children on your next, maybe your second born, let your firstborn have a normal life. But Claude McKay, he was a Jamaican born author, but he moved to New York City moved to the States in 1912 to be a part of the Tuskegee University. And this was a post-Civil War university that was both an opportunity for African-American teachers to have a salaried position to teach, but also to educate the Black youth. And there were obviously, for reasons we all understand why, there were not many of these locations in the States at that time. He didn't finish his school there because he wanted to get more experience in New York City. So he moved here in 1914, and he was drawn to the Village because there was so much progressive thought with some of the people I talked about before happening down in the Village. There was a real heavy socialist bent that was happening at that time, the early 19 teens. And some of this was coming from the fact that the Soviet Union, where socialism was really on the rise there, they were courting a lot of African Americans at that time because they knew that African Americans were alienated by the capitalistic system that was established here at the time. And they knew that there was a ripe group to contact to promote their thought. But needless to say, Claude McKay ends up trying to submit some poetry to the Masses magazine, which was a beautiful and powerful magazine at that time that was basically run by Max Eastman, Floyd Dell, and John Sloan, and just so many, Art Young, Louis Untermeyer, Ellis O. Jones, Upton Sinclair. I mean, just it was like a kind of a who's who of authors at that time that were contributing to the Masses magazine. It was the story goes that Max Eastman had heard about it a little bit, but then one day he hears a knock on the door of his apartment. He opens it, no one's there, but there's a note that says, "You've been elected the sole editor of the Masses magazine. Long hours, no pay." And he was intrigued. He checked it out, and he turned it really into a powerhouse through World War I until the government was finally able to shut it down. Not because they didn't, I mean, they shut it down because they didn't like what was being said in there, but they couldn't really stop that because of the whole freedom of speech issue. But what they could do is stop the post office from distributing the magazine using the Sedition Act. And so it kind of closed them down. But after the Masses closed down, McKay ends up meeting Max Eastman and his sister, who were starting to run a follow-up newspaper, trade magazine called The Liberator. And so McKay and Max Eastman end up having a very long friendship through this. McKay ends up submitting some pictures to some poems to the Liberator magazine that get published. And then a little bit later on, he becomes one of the editors of the Liberator magazine, working with Max Eastman, who was starting to kind of take a secondary role in that magazine. But they had a little bit of a falling out. Claude McKay ended up leaving the Liberator as an editorial staff member at a certain point. And then a year or so later, he was writing a memoir about a lot of his time living in Harlem, living in the Village, living in New York, and his time with the Liberator. And he'd written a chapter all about his time with the Liberator that was kind of a scathing review of a lot of what was going on. And Max Eastman was kind of blindsided by this. And there's a bit of correspondence back and forth between the two of them where McKay is trying to explain, I didn't leave because of these issues, and I don't, have any poor opinion of anyone there, but I was frustrated by the lack of clarity of creating a statement of where race fits in with the socialist movement, where race fits in with the struggles of class, and where race fits in with the Liberator. And he wanted a real concrete message, a concrete concept to revolve around. And the liberators, the staff weren't really comfortable coming up with an official statement. And that became his final frustration. But through conversations with Max Eastman and their friendship, McKay ended up softening and removing a lot of that from the memoir. And I've been trying to see if I could find an original copy of what he was going to say about it to get some more insight. But they did remain friends for a very, very long time. In fact, Max Eastman helped to get several of his collections published. Here's a fun picture I found of him with the Baroness von Freytag Loringhoven, who was another kind of village character. But he ended up, he went to Russia for a while, spoke with some folks, remained friends with Max Eastman, and wrote some collections on Harlem, as well as really just a lot of powerful poems. In fact, one of them I'm going to pass over to Derek right now that he wrote. It was published in The Liberator in 1921. It was not the first poem he wrote for that magazine, but I love it because it could have been written yesterday. Derek, this is America by Claude McKay from The Liberator.
Although she feeds me bread of bitterness and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth, stealing my breath of life, I will confess, I love this culture of hell that tests my youth. Her vigor flows like tides into my blood, giving me strength against her hate. Her bigness sweeps me being like a flood. Yet as a rebel fronts a king in state, I stand within her walls with not a shred of terror, malice, not a word of jeer. Darkly I gaze into the days ahead and see her might and granite wonders there, beneath the touch of time's unerring hand, like precious treasures sinking in the sand.
Claude McKay, such a powerful poem. I'm surprised that needs to be taught in schools again from 1921. And here we are 100 years later, and that poem could have been written yesterday. But having touched upon Mr. McKay, and I encourage you to look up more and read some more of this fine writer, we're going to move to our first pub finally. Opened in 1938. It was the Cafe Society. It was opened as a club, and it was opened by a gentleman in his mid-30s who had no experience running a club and decided he should open and run a club. His name was Barney Josephson, and he opened the Cafe Society along with the help of a musical producer, John Hammond. They opened it eventually at Sheridan Square. Here's another shot here of the Sheridan Square there. And he wanted it to be open. He wanted it to be desegregated. He claimed that he wanted the club to steer away from what was typical at the time, which was clubs tended to be mob run, they tended to be stuffy, and they tended to be segregated. And he wanted a club that didn't have any of those three. So he had no mob connections to support him at the time. He tried to make it much more loose and relaxed. And he thought that he had come up with the very first club that allowed blacks and whites together, both on the stage and in the audience. There were many clubs, especially up in Harlem, like the Cotton Club and others, where black performers, white only audience. But this was certainly the first in the village to have that, and certainly south of Harlem, although I believe Small's Paradise in Harlem was the very first club to have an integrated audience base. But it became one of the most iconic jazz clubs at the time. And for about 9 months, the first 9 months, John Hammond had found a young singer, and he wanted her to be a featured act there early in the club. She was a teenager. She'd been singing up in Harlem for a while, had been working with Count Basie for a little bit, had a small role in a Duke Ellington film, and then eventually comes down to the Cafe Society. And she had a song that she was singing that was very vital, very powerful, and very beautiful. And they decided that they were going to have this perform here. And Barney had set up 2 rules for this. She said it was going to be the last song of that young lady's set. The waiters were going to stop serving right before the song started. They were going to turn down all of the lights, and they were just going to have a spotlight on the performer. The performer in question was Billie Holiday, and the song was Strange Fruit.
So let me give us a little bit. First, background. The song originally starts as a song by the name of Bitter Fruit, which just actually sounds like over-expired fruit you got at the grocery store. What ends up, it comes from a gentleman by the name of Abel Maripal, who is a Jewish Bronx school teacher up in the Bronx. He's a Jewish school teacher, and he was really into workers' rights. So he wrote a lot of little ditties about singing like, we got to go do this and do that. But he writes this very hauntingly tune. and he starts letting his wife sing it and perform it. People start liking the tune, and there's Abel right there, as we see him right there to the left, and there's Lady Day herself. He actually gets in his hands over the where, and there's beautiful wife Anne, and it actually gets to a singer by the name of Laura Duncan, who sings it at Madison Square Garden, and that's when it comes into Josephine's attention, because he's at the garden that night and hears it and says, this would be the perfect song for Billy. So he sets up and meets Abel and brings it down. Now, Abel tells a different story than what Billy tells. Billy's like, from the first time I heard the song, I was in love with it. Abel's like, I don't know about it. I don't know about all that. He said he thinks he allowed the song to be sung in front of her as a really as a being nice, extending gratitude to the owners that helped put her on to this scene. But she did hear it sung, and she said she was willing to try it. Now, they did make a change in the title and a change to the music when it was first begun. And Billy was now more willing to take it on, but even then, she was scared. She understood being a Black woman in the world in a rough and tumble environment in Baltimore, where she said going in and out of brothel houses where she had worked in, her mom and her had sometimes even had to live in for a while. She said the only place that she thought that she saw integration was a brothel house. So you can make a lot of jokes on what was being integrated at the brothel house. But even when she sung it, even at Cafe Society, this is what Billy says about the song. But she was worried about singing it, even at Cafe Society, a place that catered to progressives, quote unquote. There wasn't even a platter of applause when I finished. Holiday later wrote in an autobiography. Then a lone person began to clap nervously. Then suddenly everybody was clapping. So she doesn't actually debut it. The first big time it gets known is at Cafe Society. She tried it out a couple times in Harlem. Even in Harlem, people sat on their fingers at first, kind of looked around at each other like, did she actually sing this out in front of people where folks can hear this? And then always one brave person will start clapping, and then everybody joins in. So she now has Strange Fruit, and interesting things will happen. Now, that's a good looking dog. That's a boxer. Boy, he's giving us the lip. Like, Derek, you taking too long to tell this story. All right, dog, I heard that.
The dog is not saying that.
No, I know that look from the dog. And there's fruit in the background too. Interesting enough, he always had a spotlight on Holiday's face. There would be no encore to it. People had to remember Strange Fruit, get their insides burned out by a couple performers. And she put it as a clause going forward, even at Birdland, that she could always retain the right to sing it. That doesn't mean she always sung it. As she said, I only do it for people who might understand and appreciate it. This is not a June Moon croon tune, as she said. Now, one thing she took a special pride in this, if you ever listen to her sing the song, she doesn't go too high. She doesn't go too long. She pulls it out of you. And Billy, remember I said she lived a hard life. She didn't have a lot of formal education. So when people went to talking about the W.E.B. Du Bois or the Frederick Douglasses of the world, she could only speak so much to that. She didn't really know. But what she could talk to was the joy, the pain of going through all of that. And she brought it out in the song. And that song is her gift. And it's her curse. Because it comes to the attention of one J. Edgar Hoover. And as we know, and Mr. Harry Anslinger. And if you really look, you can drop the N and almost make it Harry Asslinger, because when he got a hold of you, your ass was Here comes Mr. Anslinger. And
Anslinger.
Yeah.
Family tour.
And Mr. Anslinger is the commissioner of Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Narcotics Division is not the behemoth it is today's world. It's small within the Department of Treasury. I can't say it better than the words up on the screen for you right now. Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind, and he really did not like jazz musicians. He even said, I'm not going after the good or everyday musicians. It's those jazzy guys. So Thelonious Monk, be on the lookout. And especially now, Billie Holiday. Is this song, just like she was apprehensive and people are scared to clap, That's in progressive circles. Can you imagine non-progressive circles in the 1940s? I think we all can kind of make it. And so what happens is he actually sets out a agent to befriend her. And his name is Jimmy Fletcher. And he got into her circle, would help buy her drugs. And one time he comes and said, she's like, "Could you just slip the drugs underneath the door? Oh, girl, it's too big." And when she opens the door, he's got other agents there, and they're there to arrest her. To make a long story short, and he even ended up dancing with her. Jimmy later on said that we never paid off our debt we owed. She paid off her debt to society. We never paid off the debt. He felt bad years going forward. It was said about what had happened to her. She spends 1 year in prison, including some very hard labor. And when you spend a felon at this time, out goes your cabaret license. Bye-bye. And so, but we're going to move to another regular at Cafe Society. So that's one of the great uplifting songs and one of the great protest songs of all time and enlightenment songs. But we're going to go to another person who would definitely carry the enlightenment to our age. And this guy goes by the name of Bayard Rustin. And he's one of the more overlooked figures in the civil rights leadership in the 20th century, but that doesn't mean he wasn't one of the most influential. An openly gay man that was raised on Quaker ideals, and he helped form the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE as it's known. But before all that, just like he was with the kids, Bayard liked to sing. And there you see him strumming it up. He was a great singer. He even works and starts a group with folk singer Josh White and the great Paul Robeson. Speaking of a great baritone. So there is Mr. Robeson himself. Mr. Robeson, by the way, has ties to Greenwich Village. How Provincetown Players, boy, that's legendary name to this day in the village. And Eugene O'Neill actually saw him at the Harlem YMCA, same one that Claude McKay would live for a while. And they offered him the role for what will become the Emperor Jones later on. That will become a movie also, not just a play. But moving back to Bayard, they are together in a short-lived Broadway play called John Henry, who famously beat a machine in building railroad tracks. And Bayard will look back at his time in Greenwich Village. Here's blacks. He says this about it. It was blacks, whites, gay, straight, eclectic musicians, people who were into political aspirations. And it made me believe that I could be all or any of these things at a given time, to quote unquote paraphrase him. Why is he important? This man will be one of the key advisors to Dr. Martin Luther King, as you see right there to the right. Some people will say he will be his greatest advisor. Dr. King believed in nonviolence as far as protesting, not necessarily at home. Dr. King at that time had guns at his house. It is Rustin who got him to the Gandhi level of pacifism, and he would be his biggest organizer, as you see on the left, for the March on Washington. This is the key man that brings all of these groups together for the March on Washington. But he was a regular and a singing performer at Cafe Society. So there you go. And the last thing I would like to say about Rustin, Eric earlier gave you a prescient thought that this is a good one. In a 1987 interview with the Village Voice, he said, "I think the gay community has a moral obligation to do what is possible to encourage more and more gays to come out of the closet." There he is with good friend, very good friend, James Baldwin. And he also says this about civil rights. And this is interesting, looking at how many things have happened in our world today. 25, 30 years ago, the barometer of human rights in the United States were Black people. That is no longer true. The barometer for judging the character of people in regard to human rights is now those who consider themselves gay, homosexual, and lesbian. And he's basically saying it's okay at that time to beat up on them. So it's very interesting, this man that had this lifelong journey and working with others went down. Cafe Society, though, will crumble. Why? Paul Robeson, who we talked about earlier, was big into communism. Matter of fact, him and Bayard had a little bit of a separation. They're like, man, you a little too pro-Russian. Or you might even put Putin in before Putin was Putin. So what ends up happening
Putin was always Putin.
Putin
was
is always Putin. Rudy to Putin. He is just rotten Putin. But in 1941, Hoover, this time it's not Anslinger, it's J. Edgar. Oh boy. And we know when J. Edgar has it in for you, he is going to see it through. He opens a file on John Hammond, who is basically the musical director for Cafe Society. So this is where it's going to get really interesting. And within 2 years, he's got 2,100 pages on him. I do not believe J. Edgar Hoover is going to get 2,100 pages and not going to act. So we move forward, and what ends up happening, Josephine's brother, the club owner's brother, is one of the most outspoken members of the Communist Party. Oh boy. With the House Un-American Activities Community, and you are actually pronounced communist, yeah, you can see where this is going to go. They call him in, he refuses to testify, contempt of court. And then he, with that and all the bad press, both the Cafe Society in Greenwich Village and the one uptown, they lose $90,000 in 1 year. And that's around 1949. That's a lot of money in 2020, 2021. That's unbelievable amount of money back then. Bye-bye Cafe Society. So
there were a handful of other people who performed there. I mean, we could, go on a really long list. Obviously, some key ones we wanted to call out was Lena Horne, Teddy Wilson here, Langston Hughes. You're going to hear that name a lot. It's pretty amazing. Langston Hughes had more influence, I think, on the Black artistic community than so many other people that, at least that we're going to be talking about today. Pretty impressive man. But one of the other regulars there and a village resident briefly was Richard Wright. Now, Richard Wright was really the first mainstream Black author to have a full novel published and later a memoir that got national attention and became nationally recognized. He really kind of opened the door of that glass ceiling initially. And Native Son being the fiction in question, and then Black Boy being the memoir about himself growing up as a Black man in the South. He also had the notoriety of joining the ranks of some other writers like Ralph Ellison, Langston Hughes, Theodore Dreiser, Maxwell Bodenheim, Meridor LeSueur, Eugene O'Neill, Upton Sinclair, and many, many more, because they were part of a magazine called The New Masses. Now, The New Masses was a magazine that was started by Floyd Dell, Max Eastman, John Sloan, all of them who had been part of the Masses magazine, later the Liberator magazine. And now they were trying to capitalize as the Liberator kind of went its own way and partially crumbled. They created the New Masses to kind of call attention to their original magazine and to continue that forward of progressive liberal thought and a real artistic community, and becoming much more socially conscious as far as the rights of Blacks and others in this. And so you had Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, and others who were all contributing in there before eventually kind of the New Masses went the way of many of these magazines. But there's one quote that I really love by Richard Wright. And again, if you didn't know that this came from his book, Black Boy, you might wonder if he had written this on January 8th, because he wrote, "Our too young and too new America, lusty because it is lonely, aggressive because it is afraid, insists upon seeing the world in the terms of the good and bad, the holy and the evil, the high and the low, the white and the black. Our America is frightened of fact, of history, of processes, of necessity. It hugs the easy way of damning those whom it cannot understand, of excluding those who look different, and it salves its conscience with a self-draped cloak of righteousness." I get chills reading that and seeing what we've seen in the last month, in the last 4 years, and really longer. I mean, it just came to a head these last 4 years. But he also, Wright, had became a mentor and a friend for a while of James Baldwin, who is probably one of the best known Black writers even today. His autobiographical novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, of course, was his first novel, became a massive breakthrough. And he believed he met Richard Wright in person in the Village. I think they had corresponded beforehand, but they actually finally met face to face here in the Village. And Richard Wright, again, tried to open the door, help him a little bit with the perils of fame, help him kind of get established as a writer. But they had a bit of a falling out, because in around 1955, Baldwin wrote an essay called Everybody's Protest Novel, that later got bundled with a collection of essays that were put together in Notes of a Native Son. And in it, he he came down really hard. He was very critical on Wright, saying that the novel was confirming racial stereotypes. Richard Wright was very offended by this, obviously, and he felt that the cast, the characters were intentionally two-dimensional to serve a purpose. But the criticism was so harsh that he broke off all communication with James Baldwin, and James Baldwin felt really bad after that. He said he wasn't intending to offend; he was just trying to figure something out for himself. But he did acknowledge later on that he was probably overly harsh. He only lived in the village, Baldwin, briefly. He met the artist Beaufort Delaney for a little bit, who became a lifelong inspiration. He bussed tables at a bar on McDougal Street called the Calypso Restaurant, which was known for people like Eartha Kitt to hobnob at. Richard Wright, as we had mentioned, Henry Miller used to go there. Tennessee Williams, Paul Robeson was a regular there at Calypso, and Marlon Brando, who would later become Baldwin's roommate for a little bit. As you can see here, the young Marlon and James, the older Marlon and James. In 1948, Baldwin would eventually move to France, and this would become his real center of location. This becomes his permanent residence, basically because despite all of the progressive thought with the masses, the liberator, the new masses, the women's rights movement, all of these iconic movements that were happening there, the village and the city was still very racist. It said that he once quipped, "All of Africa will be free before I can get a lousy cup of coffee." But even while he was living in Paris and in France, he had to keep coming back to New York because he was publishing a lot. And of course, this is the center of publication, and a great place to meet Charlton Heston. A very young looking Charlton Heston, and Harry Belafonte, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and tucked away in the back. But he came back to the city many times, stayed in the village. He stayed at 81 Horatio for a while, and which is where he wrote a lot of Another Country, which is one of my personal favorites of Baldwin. And Baldwin is one of my personal favorite authors. Go Tell It on the Mountain is a heavy read. It's a powerful read. If Beale Street Could Talk is another powerful, fun isn't the right word, easy read, really captures his prose. Another Country I liked because it really represents so much of the influences of Baldwin's life. It was his time in the village, his time in Paris, his time in Harlem. He creates a multitude of characters, a white actor, a black revolutionary, a young black woman who's a singer, and he captures the point of view from so many eclectic types of people, whether you were white, black, gay, straight, male or woman, bi. Like he would write from all of these perspectives in one novel from their point of view so well that it showed me just how much he understood the human condition. And he truly is a genius of an author. And very few authors have really been able to get to that level, I think, of genius that Baldwin has created. And the fact, and you look at any picture of him, and he's almost always smiling, despite the struggles of being a gay man, the struggles of being a black man, the struggles of having to deal with the civil rights movement, all of the struggle and pain, a really hard, heavy-hitting father, pastor, strict religious views that did not accept gays. He's always happy. His eyes are shining. He always looks like he's a 10-year-old boy. And it just adds to my admiration of him that he must have been one of the nicest people around. And in fact, so much so that he became a good friend and helped Lorraine Hansberry when she got into her career. Now, she first got published in some of her early works when she first moved to New York City. She'd gone to school for a while outside of the city and then decided she wanted to further her education here. So she moved to New York. And very quickly, she had a couple of poems that got published in a magazine that was called The Masses and Mainstream. And there's that name, The Masses, again. So The Masses is in reference to the New Masses, which decided when its attendance was dropping off, it was going to merge with another socialist paper called Mainstream. So they combined their magazines and their staff together to create The Masses and Mainstream. And it was run by Floyd Dell, Max Eastman, and several others for at least a brief period of time in its early starts. So here you have that connection again. She had written a poem called Flag from a Kitchenette Window, which was her first poem that was published, at least in this magazine. And then later on, she wrote Lynch Song, which was a poem about the execution of Willie McGee. Now, her claim to fame is really, and before that, I should mention, she started writing for another trade publication based in Harlem that was called The Freedom magazine. And this was a magazine that was started by Paul Robeson. So again, we see so many of these connections and crossovers here. She wrote A Raisin in the Sun here in the Bleecker Street in the late 1950s while she was living there with her husband. And that really is kind of her claim to fame. And she was a bit of an unknown playwright at this time. This is 1959, when it's about to get produced for the first time. And she's a bit of an unknown. She's got that struggles with her, but she manages to get, because the play is such a powerful play, she gets Sidney Poitier to sign on to play the lead. And so because of those two factors, just the quality of the play and to have that kind of a prominent Black actor in the cast, when they were holding open auditions, over 1,000 Black actors showed up to be seen for that first production. Now, by this time, Baldwin and Hansberry have met briefly. Baldwin was having a play production of Giovanni's Room that was being adapted at the Actors Studio, and she had come to see it in the audience, and that's where they had initially met, and a friendship started. But it wasn't until he came in 1959 to see this play of A Raisin in the Sun that they really kind of took off together. And it was two reasons. He was one of two major factors in attendance. There were two entities, if you will, that were in attendance on that opening night. One of them was James Baldwin, who wrote that he was witnessing theater history for the first time. And the second was the FBI, that wanted to make sure that there were no communist influences in the play A Raisin in the Sun. J. Edgar Hoover protecting us from plays and songs. After that, and the movie came right on the heels of the play, she exploded as far as her fame and notoriety went. And so James Baldwin became a friend to really help guide her through those times. And then eventually in the 1960s, you start having the civil rights movements that were really going on. And they were both very active in that point, with their friendship well established, so much so that she always called him Jimmy. But what was interesting is that they never really seemed to talk much about their sexuality, because James Baldwin was openly gay. She was not. She struggled through some of her time and becoming famous with Raisin in the Sun, with coming to terms with her own sexuality. And it really wasn't until after her death that people began to understand just how much she was coming to terms with it, because she was very secretive about that. And despite the fact that she was active in the civil rights and she was supportive of the gay rights movement, she wasn't as vocal about it. And part of it is she was very private about her love life, which is by all means her right. And I certainly applaud her for that. But there was some definitely enlightened entries in some of her diaries, and more was coming to light with just where she was in her sexuality. That being said, I want to quickly move back over to Derek and give him the limelight, but I wanted to set us up in our next bar, which is the Village Vanguard, which is our second sort of central Black Bohemian bar, if you will. It was opened in 1935 or 1934, excuse me, by Max Gordon. He tried to open it on Charles Street, and he wanted it to be a forum for poets and artists and writers, but he was shut down, or he wasn't allowed to get a cabaret license because there were insufficient facilities, not enough places to go to the bathroom, which is not a great thing in a bar. So he wrote in his autobiography, he realized that, I knew if I ever was to get anywhere in the nightclub business, I'd have to find another place with 2 Johns, 2 exits, 200 feet away from a church or synagogue or school, and with the rent under $100 a month. I just want to sit on that for a second. $100 a month for a business rental in Greenwich Village. It was 1934, but still. He opens the Village Vanguard at its current location right now. A picture here in 1950. And for a while, it was a little bit of a literary haven. You had, again, Maxwell Bodenheim, Harry Kemp, excuse me, the folk music for Lead Belly. It was really kind of a lot of different acts that were going on there for a while. Eventually, he decided that he wanted it to become a jazz club, and really just predominantly be a jazz club. In fact, Sonny Rollins did the first recording of live jazz there with his A Night at the Village Vanguard, which is still to this day considered to be one of the greatest live jazz albums of all time. And it's still considered to be an extremely influential jazz album. But there was one little bit, here's Maxwell Bodenheim from the 30s, who was a regular there, but Jack Kerouac was one of the last writers to actually do any of the poetry before it became entirely jazz. And we have this shot here of 1957 doing his readings. But beyond all of the jazz, there wasn't one more literary connection, which is this gentleman here.
Langston. Oh, look at Langston. Styling while profiling. I got to give it to Mr. Langston Hughes. So in 1958, Langston Hughes does a poetry reading accompanied by the great Charles Mingus and Phineas Newborn, and it would lead to the Weary Blues album. And in this, he says, with these ebony hands on each ivory key, he made that poor piano moan with melody. Oh, blues. Swaying to and fro on the rickety stool, he played that sad, ragged tune like a musical fool. Sweet blues coming from a black man's soul. Oh, blues. Um, I don't know if we still have that possibly a video or audio. Cause there's Charles, there's Mr. Mingus, looking cool. And Charles was really interesting too, a very outspoken fellow. Sometimes he'd be playing the bass and just stop and go into a whole diatribe about politics. They'd be like, Charles, that's nice. Could you go back to the music? He was like, I'll go back to the music when I feel like it there, fella. And Charles was actually known for doing that quite a bit. But one thing that's really, really interesting about Langston Hughes, he wasn't the only one putting jazz into words. He credited songwriter and bandleader Benton Overstreet, pianist Neil Burford, and a big name lyricist Ira Gershwin for their lyrical contributions. And what he said is once at the Newport Jazz Festival, jazz is a heartbeat. Its heartbeat is yours. You will tell me about its perspectives when you get ready. So he always felt that everywhere he went, like it's a heartbeat, the jazz is always around you, and he tried to play into music. Do we have that video, Bob?
We do. We have a clip. If you give me 1 second, I can change screen shares. We have a clip of Langston Hughes performing Weary Blues. This is not the original, the Vanguard. I believe it's actually Canadian. Ariel recognized the little icon right away, but it gives you a taste of what this was like. Let's see if I do this right. You should be seeing a still shot here. And then if I press play. I have no volume control, so I think it will have to be on your end.
Rocking back and forth to a mellow groove. I heard a Negro play. Down on Mellick Avenue the other night, by the dull tower of a one-ball light, he did a lazy play. He did a lazy play to the tune of those weary blues. With his ebony hands and his ivory key, he made that poor piano moan with melody. Old blues. Playing to and fro on his rickety stool, he played that sad, ragged tune like a sweet blues, coming from a black man's soul. Old blues.
Eric, when you go on mute, your video goes on mute. The thing about Zoom.
Nobody in all this world ain't got nobody but myself. I'm trying to quit my frolic and put my troubles on the shelf. Stomp when he sprung the floor. Weary blues, I can't be satisfied. I ain't happy no more, and I wish that I had died. Far into the night, through that tune, the stars went out, so did the moon. The singer stopped playing and went to bed, while the weary blues echoed through his head. He slept like a rock, or a man that's dead.
All right. Well, that is the first time that we've tried sharing a video on there, so I apologize if it wasn't perfect. We'll be sure to share the link in the chat section near the end if you'd like to check it out. You can find it fairly easily on YouTube. So my apologies for any technical glitches with that. That was a first for us. I feel like every time I do a Zoom, I'm learning just a little bit more on how to make that kind of thing work. But Langston Hughes, as we mentioned there, let me get control. There's always that real fun shot of him. And I did want to give you a little bit. Late 70s shot, Derek.
There we go. Look at John Coltrane looking cool as ever.
Right.
Seconds left.
And the Vanguard in the before times. Hopefully we're going to get a chance to get back there in the after times while we're in our middle times, our tweens, our pandemic tweens. But as we head over to our next final bar, we did want to briefly walk by virtually 92 Grove Street, which briefly had a connection with the author Alex Haley. Alex Haley, he lived there briefly, had a little basement apartment there, and he moved there not too long after he started working for Playboy magazine, conducting a series of interviews after he'd been in the Coast Guard for 20 years and decided to follow his passion for writing. One of the first interviews that he did was with Miles Davis. And Miles Davis pulled no punches on what he thought of the world, of race relations, of fame, of being a famous Black man. It was very strong, very fiery, very controversial, and did exceptionally well. And Playboy said, we want more of these. And it really kind of kicked off numerous of these types of interviews that Alex Haley would have, leading eventually, of course, to, here's a shot of him in his 92 Grove Street studio there. I love this kind of casual shot. It looks like he's checking his cell phone, doesn't it? It looks like he's sending a text message. The man was ahead of his time.
Literally.
But the real interview that we like to talk about, that's him older now. Now that he's kicked himself off social media and knows that you can't live off your phone. But it's really this gentleman here, his interview with Malcolm X.
Now, this is really interesting. After they get the big Miles interview, they have him do Malcolm X. And obviously Malcolm X is a very prominent figure then, certainly controversial. And in a place like Playboy is a perfect forum for him. But it's when Alex goes to interviewing Malcolm X that he really realizes there's a story there. Now, Malcolm at the time wanted to everything the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us, but he realizes the story, that's great. He didn't mind hearing about Elijah Muhammad, but he realizes the story is in Malcolm and his life. And what he did is he kept trying to get that personal story out. And one of the biggest parts that it happens is he got them to talk about his mother, Louise Little, who after her husband was killed. Oh, look at Malcolm to the right. Look at that. How could you just like that beautiful smile there to the right? And there's Malcolm there to his left in his third.
You know, and I told you this picture, like when I first saw it, just like hit my heartstrings, just yanked on my heartstrings a little bit, just to see that innocent joy, like he had just won the science fair, hit a home run or something, knowing all of the crap that he's going to go through and what his end is going to be, and the influence, just all of that is gone. And right now he's just a little kid who just wants to be a little kid. And it really hit me hard when I found that picture.
Yeah. Even it made me go back, to be honest. This amazing picture you found. And when you look at Malcolm, when he went to talk about his mother who ended up losing her mind, she could not cash out the insurance policy when they assassinated. His father was very much into civil rights. Both of his parents were. And that was really interesting. And what ends up coming up is he made him go more into depth. And then as he goes more into depth, and if you read the autobiography, you get those things. That's a lot of Alex Haley's hands in the autobiography of Malcolm X. Was one of the things he talks about when Malcolm first came to New York, living in Harlem, that he worked as a railroad porter. And if you know a little bit about Black culture, he got the nickname Detroit Red. Like, what do you mean red? Some light-skinned Black people also have a little bit of tinge of red in them. And so as a man, you're called red. If you're a woman, you would be called a red bone. And so he got the nickname when he grew up in Michigan for a while. So he's like, hey, you're Detroit Red. Why can't he just be red? Because there's another red that's with him. There's a good picture of him, and it looks like his young adult years. Well, the other red would be a very famous comedian by the name of Red Fox.
There he is.
And there to the left is a young Malcolm X and a young Red Fox. And then you can see him to the right. You can almost say, man, you remember that time you lost that lady's bag? Oh, man, I had her doing something else. So they meet again later in life as Malcolm has now reformed his life and come out, and so those were the stories Alex Haley really wanted to. If you really listen, in some ways, there's also the basis telling family and life stories. This is in a lot of ways the thinking behind Roots, just on a generational level. One big thing though, there is something that's just happened recently. An entire chapter of the autobiography of Malcolm X has come out. And it's been bought by the Schomburg Museum in Harlem. There's always been a lot of arguments for people who have really studied Malcolm X that Haley toned it down on the rhetoric some to make him more appealing to the masses. And in this thing, you can see the edits and the back and forth between Malcolm and Alex as they're working. Now, yes, Alex may have more influence in the long run. Why? Because as the autobiography is set to come out, Malcolm X is slain. And we'll talk later, certainly in Q&As, about Malcolm, because he debates James Baldwin and Bayard Rustin. He debates both of them, actually. So they were not unknown to him at all. They're actually very well known to him.
And it's interesting. I used to tell a story. Sorry to jump in, but while he was writing that, Roots was being written in there, not Roots. When the interview was being in there with Alex Haley, he one of my jokes was always that if Alex Haley lost any of his notes, he could always talk to the police department, because Street Apartment, and had all of the transcripts in there. And I'm curious if maybe that's where they could find that last chapter. I know I cut into, but did that last chapter ever make it into the book, or what's the final status with that?
Never made it into the book, and it just recently got purchased by the Schomburg. I got to go back and do some research. I don't know if it'll even be inserted now in present times, but the Schomburg keeps it, has millions of items to do it, just to talk a little bit about it, but they never inserted. And for the longest time, it had been rumored that it was out there, and then somebody in their private collection or something, it came out that boom, here they actually were able to come across it and said, "Oh, here it is." You have a good story though about that interview and how something came out of it.
I'm sorry. I was listening to a podcast a couple of years ago about that interview, and Alex Haley was talking about the experience a little bit. It was like past recordings of Alex Haley, but they talked about how there was it was the police department had wiretapped the apartment, and they were illegally listening in, and there was mostly one white police officer who was doing the majority of the eavesdropping, and he became a supporter of Malcolm X. He was listening and saying, this guy is not revolutionary. He's not radical. He's right. He's fighting for people who have been oppressed. It is clear. And he really became a big backer of Malcolm X. And so I love the fact that there was a white officer illegally listening in who became a supporter for Malcolm X. But my other real fun connection that I have is that Alex Haley, of course, wrote Roots, which became a movie, which was really the starting point for LeVar Burton. Now, LeVar Burton, I am a bit of a fan of, because, of course, he eventually became on Star Trek. But even more so for me is I remember how heartbroken I was, because there's a moment when we're all somewhere witnessing history change. We can remember where we are, and we remember the moment, and we can remember how profound it was. And I remember the moment that LeVar Burton first announced that he was going to be doing, at least that I first heard, that he was going to be playing this role, because he was going to be leaving his position at a favorite show that is heavily influential for me as a child, The Reading Rainbow. And I know some of you already know, butterfly in the sky, I can fly twice as high. I know it's in your head. This was a super influential show for me. And I remember when he announced he was going to become none other than, the Star Trek character that really, really skyrocketed him to fame. And I think he brought the show back for a little bit. I don't know if it's still on, but he came back.
He has a podcast where he reads stories, and they're amazing. I recommend.
One of the nicest men possibly on the planet. But now we're going to go to our last bar. And I know we've got about 10 more minutes here, but this is the infamous 5 spot. It is sort of the last stop. It was at 5 Cooper Square. It was originally opened in 1956. But before we go into it, I did want to call out across the street while the 5 spot was there. A building is gone now. 35 Cooper Square, Federalist Building, was where Diane DePrima was running the Floating Bear alongside of Amiri Baraka. The two of them worked together in this building and produced many mimeographed copies of the Floating Bear. Amiri Baraka, really, he became like the two of them were massive fringe beat poets. She because she was a woman, he because he was black. And the story goes that he got introduced into the beat movement because he had read Howl by Allen Ginsberg, and he wrote a letter to Ginsberg on a roll of toilet paper, basically saying, "Are you for real?" And Ginsberg read this roll of toilet paper and ended up responding back with a yes, possibly some more words, and a friendship ensued. And eventually that was one of the ways that opened the door for Mary Baraka to really kind of get pulled into the beat movement. He and Diane DePrima ended up having an affair together and a daughter together out of wedlock while they were sort of married simultaneously. And eventually he was Leroy Jones at the time, later became Mary Baraka after the assassination of Malcolm X. And the Floating Bear was shut down by our friends at the FBI again, where they couldn't really, again, freedom of speech, they couldn't really stop it. What they could do is just keep taking them to court and put them out of business with legal fees, with all the costs that they had to spend to run up. But Amiri Baraka, he, one of his ways that he also became a literary giant is he got connected with somebody else over at the Five Spot when he met Langston Hughes, who was a regular Five Spot. And Langston Hughes, of course, helped forward his career even more. But, apart from some of the literary connections, and again, you had a lot of Elvin Jones, Blossom Derry, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, Gregory Corso. There's just so many of those names. It was also became very heavily a really sort of low-key, down-to-earth jazz club.
Yeah, so this place was less jazz aware and need for a cultural center. And the Termini brothers started realizing that people just wanted a place to gather, and they got really a little bit lucky. Thelonious Monk is now trying to reinstate that cabaret card. What a drug bust. At this time, Coltrane is coming back and is having the struggles with things. So a lot of people are on the rebound or trying to rehab their life, and now they have a place that offers no cover charge. Oh, always my favorite words when we're going in to hear live music. No cover charge, and it's very cheap. So now you can come in here, and they would have some really interesting persons. I was reading a story by noted jazz historian, and he was saying it, who had lived, and he was like, "We love this guy on the piano, but they didn't think much of him. But they wanted to kick him off, but then they realized all the people who were loving him were the only people paying a lot for their drinks at the bar. They're like, well, we can't get rid of the paying customers for these jokers that don't." So they just let them continue to play. And out of just allowing these people a little bit offbeat, Thelonious kind of reasserting himself back onto the scene, they had a legendary place move out of this. Charles Mingus, going back to him, he led the final performance at the bar. Now, a lot of painters were there too, from what I understand. A lot of painters hung out at that bar. Moving back, though, we're going to move back to Eric as he gets to talk about our last person or two here.
Wow, and I'm actually answering a question here in the chat about how Hetty Jones, who was married to Leroy Jones while she was having that affair with Diane DePrima. I'm sorry, typing and PowerPoint and talking all at the same time. But yeah, each week as Derek and I would meet and socialize and just kind of come back with some new research, we would find another tie back to something we'd found last time. Or we get excited, like, hey, you were talking about that magazine. Well, I just found out so-and-so also wrote for that magazine. And we just kept finding that this like sphere of influence was getting tighter and tighter, and that all these people who were intertwined together. And another great example of that is not necessarily Cecil Taylor at the Five Spot. That was another slide that was in there. And here's another shot of Thelonious Monk recording at the Five Spot that was there. A couple of albums there, but it's Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde was also within the sphere of influence, mingling with all of these people. She was born in the city, but she solidified who she was while she was in college, where she really came to terms with her sexuality, with her race, and her need to be a poet. And this was right around sort of 1954. Pretty soon, you're going to have the Civil Rights Act, which was, and the Civil Rights Movement, which she was going to become a very powerful player for, both in the village and beyond. But some of her earliest opportunities as a poet were thanks to none other, of course, than Langston Hughes, because Langston Hughes was running another trade magazine called Negro Poets USA. And she would publish regularly there. He became a supporter, helped open some of those doors. But her first collection of poetry was called The First Cities, and it was edited by Diane DePrima, who was a classmate and a very good friend of hers at the time. And it made her a major voice in what was known as the Black Arts Movement, a movement that was started by Amiri Baraka. And it's kind of fitting because she was already active in the civil rights, the equal rights, and the gay rights, the three things that she embodied literally the most as Audre Lorde. So it was a matter of time before she would become part of the Black Arts Movement. But 2 years later, her collection, The Black Unicorn, really kind of took the Black Arts Movement by storm, because it was, she wrote a lot about African deism, the deities of Africa, being the fertility, creation, her warrior strength, and all of those things were really kind of pushing a feminine side and sort of a cultural religious side that was going very separately from what Amiri Baraka and a lot of the other men were doing. And so it really kind of turned her into an icon for that movement. 1978 was also the year that she was diagnosed with breast cancer, which would end up being her cause of death in 1992. But right before she died, she was in an African naming ceremony. Before her death, she took the name Gamba Adisa, which means warrior, she who makes her meaning known. But this is the guy that we want to end with here.
So again, it's just an interesting thing. I'm not going to spend more than about a minute. This is the only picture, and I was just listening to a radio, I think it was on WNYC, of a young lady, basically a story of a young lady to find out this was her father, and even how she couldn't barely find pictures of him. But Bob Dylan says something big about this guy. He said there's a whole group of people. This was in 1985. He said nothing's really all the way new nowadays. He said there was this whole group of guys from south of the border. Big Brown was from Texas, and he said he was in and out of jail a lot. He said, but he brought some of the best poetry I ever heard. Bad man raps, as he said, love, law, breaking the law, politics. He said everything in it. He says it is some of the best poetry I ever heard. He said today we just call them poets, but today you would call them rappers. And I started found it very interesting that he said he was also partially an inspiration for himself. But Big Brown, even his daughter, that comes to find out from her mom that this is her actual father, and that he had come up to their house, I think it was in Massachusetts or Connecticut, and never and they didn't hear back from him, and they're trying to find out all as she goes through her life. That as much as we know some of the history, there's figures like this in the park, or playing in different streets or just outside of clubs, that also propelled that culture, as we know about the whole generation of writers, whether it's the Beatniks to the Dylans to the Big Browns, that make up the village to be what the village is. On to Eric.
Yeah, and I like the fact that Bob Dylan, as you mentioned, many years later still remembered this guy who really is a relative unknown, and it's not something I'd kind of heard of at any point. And I kind of wanted to show the young Bob Dylan because I really feel like those are the only years where he had any merit before he became a little bit of a persnickety older fellow. But I remember hearing Allen Ginsberg talking in an interview one time about how if you look at any kind of craft, arts or blacksmithy or knitting or any kind of craft like that, that generally you have one person or a group of people who create something, a skill, bring it to a level, and then it's the next generation that can take that, transform it, and bring it to something new. And that is the progress of everything, whether what any kind of craft or skill or technique or art form. And he said he never really felt like that had happened until Bob Dylan for the Beats. He said Bob Dylan was the first person from the Beats to really kind of take what they were trying to do and move it forward. And I'm always amazed that even for Bob Dylan, he was taking what was going on by some unknown poet, Big Brown, and was such a major influence for him and his writing at that time. And it kind of begs the question, who are the people that we've missed? Who are the other influences in the writers that we'll never know their names, who influenced the people who said a comment that inspired someone to write a poem, or sang a song in the park and inspired someone's play or someone's performance? who knows who you've influenced or we've influenced. And so on that note, thank you very much for spending this hour and 14 minutes with us today. It's been certainly for me a joy. And I will say my knowledge as a guide, my experience as a guide and a virtual presenter is so heavily because of Derek and the friendship that we've been able to really kind of expand on over the last 7 or 8 weeks. Every Thursday night, meeting up here, talking a little bit more, trying to figure out how are we going to get this down to even an hour and 15 minutes. So I thank you and cheers to you, Derek. This has been an absolute pleasure. I've learned an awful lot. And I've grown a lot, I think, as a person, hopefully as a guide. And I hope that the people who are part of this enjoyed that as well.
I've grown a lot. There's story about the masses, so many the different literary things, your help with the presentation. It's just been good. I think sometimes you can give orders to my dog. I think he knows your voice well enough now for the last 8 weeks. He's like, hey, what Eric tell me to do this time?
Well, and I will say, I think Ariel's going to post some links for tips. I know we're in a pandemic, and I think probably like me, many of you know what that feels like, and probably like you, I'm not working as much. Derek's not working as much. So if you have the ability, it's certainly appreciated. And if you don't, because like us, you are not a means to do so, we understand, and there's no pressure. We are all in this together. Hopefully, this tour is helping to bring us even more so to be all in it together, because we really are, and we need to be. And I hope that we can get to that point. So thank you so much.
Did you want me to answer any of I saw a couple of these questions. I told people I will get back. I saw all the way up to Deb. I've been looking at them. I think Deb is off, but I will answer a couple of her questions and things that she had. So I'm certainly here to answer any.
Yeah, I only want to keep us on for a few minutes just because we're already pretty late. But yay, thanks everybody. Thanks for the feedback. Yeah, I think there were some questions about James Baldwin.
Okay, so James Baldwin, one of the things he didn't want to spread about civil rights, but there's this thing that had happened when there's a group of, there's only one black regiment that fought in the First World War, and they were out of Harlem, called the Harlem Hellfighters, the Fighting 369th. When they went to France, they brought jazz with them, and they formally introduced jazz to France, and they were given the top military honor in France. And from that point, black people have heard that they're always going to get a lot of recognition in France, because it won't just be Baldwin that goes there. It'll be Dubois, Josephine Baker, who will become a big star over there. It's a lot of different people will make their way to France. And it's all because of the recognition the Harlem Hellfighters got. So yes, he did want to spread civil rights when he was over there, as others did, but a lot of them were just like, hey, they actually like me over here, I'm out. So it's not all one, but it's not other. James did also, both him and Bayard were told not to play vocal frontsmen for the civil rights movement. And they were worried about the gay message. So yes, that did happen for those. And about the FBI setting him up to be murdered. Well, what do you want me to tell you? If you watch the show on Netflix, so they had a 5-part series. I actually met that tour guide before when I'm roving and I'm in DC. He had a whole thing about Malcolm X, and you can find it on Netflix. You probably find it. When they asked, including Cory Booker, at that time, senator out of New Jersey, the guy that did the final shot, the shotgun shot to Malcolm X, if the most interesting thing I will say about that is the mayor of the city all but had heard the rumor, knew it, and was like, oh, yeah, I've heard it. Booker basically said he heard it. He's like, oh, allegedly, but it was an open secret. Like all these people know. And the thing I would ask you is, if you think all of them know, you think the FBI knows less? Especially when you see how much Hoover had reams of information on people. So I won't exactly answer that, but I'll leave it open for you to probably figure out what they did or did not know at some level. So yes.
Thanks for all of that. And thank you to you both. That was so delightful and yeah, wild and wonderful. I'm really, really grateful. And I'm grateful to all of you who are here with us. Thank you for joining us. I am going to send you all an email with many links, including a link to our survey. If you have a few minutes to do that, we would greatly appreciate it. And I think I'm going to call it. So have a good night, everyone. Take good care.